Going to start recording the podcast now and say this is another T-Rex talk. This one is not live on YouTube because of weather. Not enough people are here in the media room to record or to stream live to YouTube properly at the standard to which we have become accustomed. But I am live on Instagram just because I wanted to get some Q&A. Whenever it's just me talking, it doesn't feel much like a T-Rex talk or a conversation. So I am streaming live on Instagram just from my phone because that's pretty easy and simple to do, and nobody says that Instagram lives look lame and ugly when they're just a phone. So what I'm going to talk about today is something that I'm calling the Doctrine of Anti-Fragility, which is not really a thing. It's not one of the great theological or historical doctrines of the early church or anything like that. But anti-fragility has a more visceral sound to it than just endurance or resiliency. Anti-fragility, I think, makes it really clear what you're talking about. So as we're talking about weather, as we're talking about various things that happened the last week, building up your ability to endure, build up your ability to have patience, building up your ability to be steadfast, or your ability to not be fragile is something that is extremely important for the Christian, and is something that is extremely important, I would say, for everybody that wants to be a positive force in the world. Anyone that wants to be a net plus, anyone that wants to be able to help others must be anti-fragile. So that is something that is really, really key and important. And we've seen that to some extent just over the last few days. We've had winter storms, which are not that big a deal for certain parts of the country, but a much bigger deal for other parts of the country. So here in Tennessee, we have a couple of inches of ice, pretty solid ice on the ground, which is very difficult to deal with. And then down in Texas, there are temperatures that are completely unexpected, or at least rare enough that the infrastructure cannot handle them. So that is something that is interesting. If you want to be prepared for things, it is important that you develop your threat model. What is it that you're actually preparing for? If you live in the frozen north, you have to be really prepared for cold and for snow. If you live in Texas, you don't really need to be prepared for blizzards in the same way, but when they do happen, you see the weaknesses in whatever infrastructure is there. So in Texas, you have power outages, not because the power is being knocked out by the snow, but because Texas homes are not really set up to be heated the way that they need to be heated in these temperatures, and it's pulling a lot more electricity and causing rolling blackouts and stuff like that. So the infrastructure isn't there to support these kind of difficulties, which means that you can take a greater responsibility to prepare for certain things. But again, it sort of depends on your threat model, because you cannot be prepared for literally everything. And the way that modern society has kind of been built out is you aren't responsible for certain things. It's the infrastructure that is. So you're not responsible to have a backup power supply or a backup heat supply because that's something that the infrastructure is supposed to, they're supposed to be able to handle that, and you don't have to worry about it or think about it. And to some extent, that works. And if you are willing to just be without power for a certain number of days a year, then that's fine. That's an excellent choice that you could make to save money on a generator, is to just realize that you're going to be without power and to be set up for that. So I, at the moment, do not have a generator, but I do have a battery backup for all the computers and electrical stuff in the house, so that we do have I do have the ability to keep working for a while when the power is out and not lose stuff on my computer. So that is one way that I'm prepared for certain things, and it makes me less fragile than if I didn't have those things. Someone from Dallas is saying there's not actually rolling blackouts. They're not rolling at all. Been out of power for 41 hours. So yes, when infrastructure fails, it generally fails in a way that is cascading, or there's a domino effect to it. So and then you have multiple disasters kind of pile on each other. So if you can't keep certain buildings heated, then you're also going to have pipes freezing. And then once the pipes burst, you're going to have some level of water damage that's going to affect other aspects of infrastructure. So relying entirely on the systems that are there, that have been built for maximum efficiency but not maximum resiliency, is often a bit of a problem. And that's true for big systems and for little systems. So you should think about what it is that you are prioritizing. If you are prioritizing maximum efficiency, then I would recommend that you not carry a flat tire, or you not carry a spare tire, because spare tires are heavy and you get better gas mileage if you don't have a spare tire, and all of the equipment required to change a tire. But if you want maximum resiliency, then you should definitely carry that stuff. And it kind of depends on how you even calculate efficiency. So there are companies that have been calculating in the past efficiency in real small little slivers, so that their maximum efficiency requires just-in-time manufacture or just-in-time inventory. But what happened in 2020 was a whole bunch of disasters happened to the supply line, and so that maximum efficiency that they had month to month went away in 2020 because they didn't have the resiliency, they didn't have the extra stock that is less efficient in the short term, ended up being something that would have increased company efficiency or company profitability in the long term. So these are some things that need to happen. And I think that decentralization is something that is extremely important. There is a desire to build out bigger and more efficient but more fragile systems because of their high efficiency. And then what happens is, if you have an area like Texas, which has its own power grid, that's going to have the really hard-hit areas are actually going to have a negative effect on the other places. So all of that money that you saved by having a more efficient giant system in the good times ends up being more expensive than you planned, simply because of the significant damage or hit that you took to a much larger area because of that interconnectedness. So a decentralized power network is actually something that we should be looking towards. And this is actually an interesting test of environmentalists, because green power systems, green energy solutions are actually far more efficient and effective on a small decentralized scale. We lose a huge amount of efficiency in our power grid by how far we actually transmit power. And that's okay based on our original power grid system, which was we were going to have gigantic power stations, and their sheer size and power and the sheer extra electricity that comes out of nuclear reactors is going to justify the 60 to 70% electrical loss that happens over these huge high-tension power line systems that run from grid to grid all the way across the country. Now, when you switch to something like solar panels, or you switch to something like wind farms that get iced up, by the way, as people have been discovering this past week, now you can't really afford to lose 70% of your power just through transmission. So this is a very interesting thing where a lot of environmentalists are not actually being consistent. They want green energy, but they also want a gigantic centralized system, regardless of how efficient that is, because they want gigantic centralized control, which tells you something about their consistency. So that is something that I would love to see happen in the future, is decentralized power grids and decentralized everything. In the past, there definitely used to be a much more decentralized power system. And there were some advantages and there were some disadvantages to that. But one of the advantages was a greater resiliency and people taking greater responsibility in their own communities and what they were actually in charge of. One of the ways that I would categorize, or one of the ways that I would, as I mentioned earlier, there seems to be a level of inconsistency when people talk about efficiency or resiliency, or when environmentalists talk about the need for green energy sources like wind power, but they freeze up and you end up having to fly a helicopter, which is a fossil fuel, fairly expensive use of fossil fuels, and then you have to pour chemical de-icers all over the wind farm, and then you lose a bunch of the money in the gigantic infrastructure of the huge power grid, and then there's not a great way to store that power unless it's lithium batteries, which are chemically horrific and generally rely on slave labor, sometimes child slave labor to create. Now, that's a pretty inconsistent saving the planet mechanism. So we need to have a standard by which we can actually judge these things properly. And one of the ways that I would want to judge resiliency or anti-fragility would be ability to help other people, not just individually survive, not just by yourself be okay, not just selfishly subsist, but what's your ability to help other people? I think that's a really important metric for anti-fragility and taking greater responsibility, especially because the opportunities that arise when stuff fails, when stuff breaks down, when the weaknesses in the system begin to show, when the cracks begin to show, opportunities to step up and help people and demonstrate a better way of doing things and learn and grow yourself, those all come out. So there have been a number of opportunities just in the last few days here in our community where people have done that. People have been able to do that. People have been able to build relationships with their neighbors because they had a four-wheel drive vehicle with a winch and they could help their neighbors, or because they had a better vehicle or they had better access to this or better access to that, they were able to go to their neighbors and say, do you need any milk? Do you need any eggs? I have extras. Or I have a four-wheel drive vehicle and I can get to the store. I know that you don't want to go to the store right now. Those are all opportunities that we should be prepared to take and help others. So one of the things that you see in Scripture, in the New Testament, there's a phrase, be ready for every good work, or be prepared for every good work. The phrase, every good work, shows up 7 times in the ESV. And so that is something that is obviously very important. And it usually goes with be prepared for, or be ready for, or be equipped for. There is an element, even though it's talking about being spiritually spiritually prepared, being equipped in wisdom, being personally able to do this in a spiritual and character sense, there also is an element of being physically equipped to do some of these things as well. And that shows up in some of the other verses, which unfortunately I closed that tab, but we could do a Bible study on that later sometime. So that is something that I think everybody needs to be doing, and to, again, have a goal so that when we do this cost-benefit analysis of what we're trying to accomplish, a metric for preparedness, a metric for anti-fragility, for resiliency, for endurance is going to be our ability to take on our responsibilities, but also help other people. And one of the reasons that we're seeing issues, not just in the power grid, not just in the inability of certain warm weather places to deal with 2 inches of ice, we're seeing massive failures of centralized systems in government and various other places. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then how could you not know what I'm talking about? I can't even bring up enough examples of this, but the way that the government has handled basically everything that the government tries to handle is a perfect example of a failure of centralized systems. Now, the government does have a purpose, the government does have responsibilities, but they are very limited. And in the 20th century and the 19th century, the United States federal government especially, but also the state governments, have taken on more and more and more of other people's responsibilities that are not theirs, and they're not good at them. And what has happened is something that's very unfortunate, which is we get lazy because our responsibilities have been taken away. And it becomes very expensive to fix this problem, and difficult to fix this problem, because the government doesn't want to give those responsibilities back to us, and they're taking a lot of our money to take on those responsibilities that they are failing at. And so we end up in a very difficult position where we are paying for the large failed system being done by the people whose job it isn't, and then somehow with the money that we have left over, we have to build a working system and take back those responsibilities on the side of everything else that we're doing, on the side of pre-existing safety nets that don't really work. So that is something that we have to be prepared to do if we're actually going to be prepared for every good work. We have to be prepared to do some things that are difficult, that are painful, that are expensive, and that are socially unacceptable because they fly in the face of the status quo or normality. Things like, and there's less of this now, and I actually see this as a pretty good trend, but we actually see a trend where more and more people, despite what the Democratic Party says about gun control, more and more people understand why you might want to own a firearm for personal protection. Not for hunting, not for sport, not for target practice. More and more people understand, I believe, why you might want a firearm for personal protection, why you might want body armor, why you might want a generator, why you might want some plywood to cover up your windows, why you might want a bigger car, why you might want extra food. I think more people understand this because they see that the centralized systems are a lot more fragile than anybody understood or thought about, even a few years ago. So I think this is a good trend that is coming out of some bad outcomes. And we need to be prepared to help people out when those systems fail, because there's this idea that society and the government in particular are the safety net for difficult situations. And the fact is that is not the case. It's not the government's job to be the safety net for very many things. And they've really taken that on in many different ways. And so it's really up to us now to build additional working safety nets, while, again, the government is still taking our money to pay for failed safety nets that are outside of their actual jurisdiction. Things like homeschooling. I'm homeschooling my kids, even though I'm still paying the government money to run the school system. And Tennessee is actually not terrible. I mean, academically, Tennessee is pretty terrible, but we're only spending $10,000 per year per student when the schools are mostly closed. We might spend a little bit more than that next year when the schools are a little more open. But that's a crazy amount of money that's going to a system that for the last 12 months hasn't been open very much, and academically speaking isn't doing very much. But we have to keep paying that money while we do the alternative. And that is something that's just going to have to be how we go for a while. We and our country has a lot of broken systems, and fixing the systems will be expensive. In the same way that there's a bunch of stuff that's broken in Texas because of the way the infrastructure worked, it's going to be expensive to fix that, but hopefully it'll be fixed in a better way. So I want to talk about the fact that that is difficult, but it also is an opportunity for us to grow in multiple areas at once and to be anti-fragile. And there's a bunch of ways in which this is the case. So, for example, we have, this week I mentioned earlier, we switched away from Vimeo. There's a whole bunch of companies that are being kicked off of a whole bunch of different platforms. We've been kicked off of PayPal. We've been kicked off of a few different insurance companies, a few different banks, a few different credit card processors have not wanted to deal with us because we're associated with firearms, or because we're associated with conservative stuff, or because we do Instagram and YouTube Live that are kind of like this one. I'm not sure. We haven't done anything truly horrific, like change our personal pronouns to beep, bop, and boop. Nothing insane like that. But we do talk about people being more personally responsible, and we do sell tools that allow people to be more prepared for difficult times and be more prepared for helping others. And so, so we're banned from PayPal. Now, we did not get kicked off of Vimeo. I want to make that clear. But we were prepared for a situation where we would no longer have Vimeo, and we watched Vimeo kick a few other people off. In fact, a ministry that I used to work with kicked a bunch of videos that I made personally, for this ministry. They kicked them off and just left me with a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth. So we decided to leave Vimeo and move over to a situation that is a little bit better. And pretty soon, at some point, we're probably not going to be on YouTube anymore, so we're hoping to move over to systems that are a little bit better for things like podcasts. If you're listening to this, you're listening to this on the podcast, I hope. I'm not sure how else you're getting this, except for you live viewers. So that is something that is a little bit like the public school system. There's a bunch of free or subsidized or ad-supported or federally supported platforms that other people are using for commerce, for communication, for marketing. And then there's a class of people who are not allowed to be on those platforms. And it's more expensive for us to build our own. And yet, I think there's going to be more resiliency, more strength, more endurance, less fragility on those systems. So in the short term, it looks like we're doing the far more difficult, the far less efficient thing than using the cheap, the free, the large, big centralized systems that exist that everybody else is using to get ahead. But if there's ever a hiccup, if there's ever difficulty with some of those big systems, the people who went out of their way to buy expensive and unnecessary superfluous equipment like generators, body armor, video servers, those people are actually going to have a pretty significant market advantage. So that is something that I want us to take in mind. Even as we pay for this extra stuff, as we do this additional above and beyond stuff, like homeschool our children when perfectly good free education exists, you're actually investing in something that gives you a significant advantage in the long term as opposed to the short term. Having extra food in a generator is something that gives you a significant advantage in the long term if you look at the long space of time in which disasters are going to happen. I mean, they are going to happen. These things are very, very important to think about. And I want to talk about this as, again, going back to that point of not just survival, but our ability to build and to help other people. So one of the things that people have said occasionally, I saw one person in particular say this as they watched various conservatives being kicked off of various platforms and various tyrannies happening from the government level. Basically, anybody who is smart, anybody who has a business, anybody who is succeeding needs to go galt, which is basically a reference to the Ayn Rand book where basically all the smart people in society, because of the tremendous taxes and the tremendous tyranny, the tremendous injustices that were being done to them, basically just backs out of society, just vanishes, just disappears. And I actually am going to take issue with this. This is the book Atlas Shrugged, by the way. At some point I want to talk about Ayn Rand. I'm not a big fan, and I'm actually not a huge fan of Atlas Shrugged. I like elements of it, but it's actually super hard to read. And every time I open it up and I see that it's 20,000 pages long, I always kind of stop reading. But this idea that you just check out, you just disappear, you just stop engaging in a society that is so fundamentally messed up is very appealing. And yet at the same time, that is not something that builds communities or helps other people. So I would recommend that what we do is we not go galt, we not disappear. What we do is we try to help everybody else go galt. We try to help everybody else disconnect from the fundamentally flawed and broken system, even though that is difficult and expensive. And it's not just financially expensive, and it's not just difficult in terms of the time that it takes. There is another cost as well, which is the criticism that you get. And this is a great day to talk about this because it is the day that Rush Limbaugh's death is being celebrated by people on the left. Rush Limbaugh is a fascinating figure. He's not someone that I always agreed with or saw eye to eye with, and in fact, I haven't even listened to his show in a very, very long time. But the way that people are reacting to his passing is very interesting, and in many ways, discouraging to see that to be somebody who has ideas and wants to talk about them, who wants to speak the truth, who wants to call out corruption or problematic stuff, gives you so much hate. And the desire to just have some extra food, to have some extra heating capability, to homeschool your children. All of these things are going to cost you so much money. They're going to cost you so much time. And then to speak out about these things is going to cost you so much in terms of you're just going to have so much oppression and so much sniping from people on the internet. Is very interesting. And it's also very discouraging to think about. But we shouldn't be discouraged by that. I met somebody who has been speaking the truth for a very long time. And I haven't known this person or paid that much attention to this person for a huge amount of time. But someone who has told me that person, they're still speaking the truth. They're still standing up, but they have gotten a little crabbier over the decades. And it got me thinking about somebody that I met last year, someone that I had been following and reading and paying attention to for decades. And he also has had significant persecution for his work in speaking the truth and expositing the Bible and commenting on culture. But I think that he has actually mellowed and gotten less grouchy over the last couple of decades. And at some point I want to talk about why cynicism isn't a virtue. There's an idea that being a crusty old, grouchy, get off my lawn, cynical, world-weary guy is a sign of great depth and of great wisdom. And I don't think that it is. It certainly doesn't have to be. And that is why I want to encourage us, even as we see depressing things, like the amount of hatred that is being poured out on Rush Limbaugh on the day of his death. The number of people who are rejoicing that somebody who stood up for conservative ideas is gone makes them rejoice and throw parties. And it reminds me of the decades of hatred and vitriol that's been poured out on him for basically my whole life. And that is very discouraging, but we're not supposed to be discouraged by that. Jesus tells his disciples in Matthew 5, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." Now, if they actually have a legitimate beef against you, there's no blessing in that. But if you are being persecuted for the sake of Jesus' name, there is great virtue and blessing in that. And we're at a point now in American culture where you don't even have to mention Jesus' name. You just have to use the wrong pronouns or point out that man and women are made differently from one another to be hated for exactly the same reasons. So while it's easy for us to initially be discouraged by that, that is a tremendous opportunity that should not get us down. We should have a metric that is more than just mere survival. It is the ability to help others. And when it comes to the commentary of others, we should have a metric that is not just what other people say, but what is actually right, what is correct and what is actually morally right. What does God say about this and God think about this is much more important than what Vice and Vox and various blue check marks on Twitter think about this or what they think about us. So when we see difficulties, when we see calamities or disasters or failures or horrible things, these are things that we need to treat properly, but they're also opportunities for us to learn from failure. When we see weaknesses, those are opportunities for us to fix them. And there are people that need help, and it's an opportunity for us to help them. But it's also an opportunity for us to grow. And if we have good goals, we have something that we can do the cost-benefit analysis with, and we can have an understanding of where we're actually headed if we have the right standard. And there's a whole bunch of ideas in Scripture that back up this idea of the doctrine of anti-fragility. Again, that's not a real thing. I just made that up. But this idea of the Christian having endurance and having steadfastness and not being fragile and not being dissuaded by persecution, that is throughout the Scripture, and those are real doctrines of the church and have been for centuries. I just call it the doctrine of anti-fragility because it's catchy and it sounds cool. So here's a few verses from the book of James. Chapter 1, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And this idea, that word for steadfastness or constancy or endurance happens 33 times in the New Testament, and there's other adjectives or there's other words that are similar that get used a lot. I didn't have time to do a real deep Bible study on this, but this ability to be equipped for every good work, this ability to be content in the face of trials and difficulties, and actually learn from them. This ability to be steadfast and to have endurance and to have perseverance in difficulty, not just to prove that you're tough, to prove that you personally can survive, but so that you can go out and you can do every good work, is an extremely important one, especially as the way that the world tends to be going is more isolationist, in terms of your actual personality, and more collectivist outside of your actual personality, so that you need to focus just on you, but you also don't have any responsibilities. They're all collective responsibilities. We need to do the opposite of that. We need to do the opposite of both of those things. We need to take on responsibility and go help other people, and that is something that as we look around and we see failures in systems, we see the need for alternatives. And as we look around and we see people that are hurting for whatever reason, we see people that need help and opportunities for us to grow in our ability to help them and grow in the responsibilities that we can take on, to be faithful in little things and then go on to be faithful in big things. It's a pretty convoluted, mixed up podcast, but that's what I was thinking about today. Looking at the ice storm, looking at people getting kicked off of platforms, looking at people commenting on Rush Limbaugh's death. They're not directly connected, but indirectly, they all come back together to encourage me personally to be more resilient, to be less fragile, and to try to be equipped for every good work. So hopefully that's something that encourages you, you guys as well, and to be building that standard where you know what goal you're trying to accomplish, and you're not going to let the blue check marks on Twitter dissuade you. You know what you're actually trying to do, so you can make a good cost-benefit analysis on where you're going to spend your time and where you're going to spend your money so that you can help the most people in the ways that are genuinely helpful. These things are very important. And if you work through these things and study through these things, you can not only be less fragile, but then you can help other people be a lot less fragile as well, even when they're living in a world that values fragility because it creates greater dependency on various systems and platforms that may be out there. So that's the podcast for today. It's hopefully you are subscribed to our newsletter and you're subscribed to the podcast and telling other people about the podcast. And hopefully we are going to do more of these shorter ones and more of the more focused ideological ones, interspersing the ones where we talk about gear and equipment. Obviously, gear and equipment, very important tools for this idea of taking responsibility, protecting other people, etc. But the mindset, the ideology, and the theology of this also extremely important. So these are things that we would like to do more of, and hopefully some more book recommendations too. So thank you so much for listening, and next week there will be another episode of the podcast, and probably it will be broadcast live on YouTube as normal because surely this ice will have melted by then.